Okay. We're going to get started in just a minute. If you could take your seats, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started. So please take your seats. Welcome. I'm Jen Mitchell-Jackson with Opinion Dynamics, and I am a board member with the California Energy Efficiency Industry Council. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you tonight to the Speaker Series event, Driving the Future of Energy, a discussion of energy in the context of climate, innovation, and business models. We have a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. You may have already seen, but the restrooms are on the other side of this wall. You can either exit through the door here or go through security. You need to make sure you have your tag on, and they'll let you in and out of security. In the case of an emergency, there will be an alarm that goes off. There's a door here and a door at the back on both sides. You can exit through the door that you entered in, and there are glass doors to the left of the place where you signed in, and what you need to do is cross over the street and go to Bechtel Plaza, and that's the meeting place in the case of an emergency. We are looking forward to an exciting panel discussion tonight. The discussion is part of the Efficiency Council's Speaker Series. The series fosters education and discussion among the energy industry. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Efficiency Council, we are an industry trade association consisting of engineering and architecture firms, contractors, program implementation and evaluation firms, energy service companies, financing firms, workforce training entities, technology companies, and manufacturers of efficient products. Our mission is to support appropriate energy policies, programs, and technologies that foster long-term growth of energy efficiency and support clean, reliable, reasonably priced, and stable energy infrastructures for all of California. The event would not be possible without the support of our member organizations and our sponsor, the Energy Foundation, so we want to thank Energy Foundation. We also want to thank our utility partners, PG&E, SCE, and the Semper Utilities. The format for tonight's event includes a brief introduction by our moderator, and then we'll have 10 minutes of comments from each of our speakers, followed by a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. And during the Q&A, what we'd like to do is have you write your questions on the note cards that you received when you came in. You can hand it to the edge, and we'll have runners in the aisles that will pick up the note cards and bring it up to the moderator. And with that, I will introduce the moderator for tonight, Steve Schiller. Steve is one of the founders of the Efficiency Council, and he's a huge contributor to our industry. He's 30 years of experience in the energy industry with a focus on demand-side energy efficiency, renewables, and independent power. He is also incredibly active in domestic and international efforts associated with incorporating energy efficiency into greenhouse gas reduction strategies. If you can name it, he's done it. He's been an engineer, a researcher, advisor, facilitator, consultant, and he runs his own international energy project management and engineering firm. And tonight we have the pleasure of having him be our moderator. Please welcome Steve.
Well, thank you very much, and certainly thank you to Jen Mitchell-Jackson, who just did our introduction, very kind. Unfortunately, some of the things that I do that she didn't mention, the authorities aren't aware of, so I appreciate her not mentioning those. I also want to particularly thank Jen and her company. Jen's the president of Opinion Dynamics. This has been one of our strongest members and supporters within the Efficiency Council, and it's her firm that's done all the logistics, provided all the support. So thank you, Jen, and thank you to Opinion Dynamics for making this evening's event possible. You know, in terms of our discussion this evening, when I think of energy use and our energy infrastructure of the future that's going to support, you know, having that type of clean, reliable, et cetera, energy supply and support, I think of four driving factors. One of those is climate. You know, that we are living in a carbon-constrained world. I think about the business model of how we operate our markets, in particular for our utilities, and their interest in how they supply power and how they support the distribution, transmission of our power, and how they support the services associated with that. And I think about innovation, and I think about technology and what needs to happen for us to get to that future that we want. And so when we put together this talk this evening, I thought about 3 people that would best speak and represent for that. And to my great joy and continuous amazement, all 3 of them said yes. And they're here this evening. And so we have some people who are truly expert in this field. And together we're going to talk about what it's going to be for our future and what are some of those drivers. When I spoke with them and asked them to speak this evening, I told them about our audience, that you're a group of folks who are very experienced, have a lot of background, and have a lot of belief and enthusiasm for that. I think the common theme I talked to them about was to challenge us. Provide us some information and challenge us in a way that their experience and expertise can bring to that. So with that, I want to introduce who our 4 speakers are. I think most of them sort of go without saying, but first of all is Mary Nichols, who's the chair of our California Air Resources Board. Mary's also been with US EPA, as well as with California's Resources Agency. And she, to me, and I think many of us in California, is a hero with respect to our efforts at controlling climate change. Dr. Arun Majumdar, another, I like to think, a friend of mine. Arun is the former acting Undersecretary of Energy at the Department of Energy, appointed by President Obama. As important, or perhaps even more important, when I think of in terms of tonight's topic, Arun was the founding director of DOE's Advanced Research and Projects Agency, ARPA-E, which was, and Arun can talk to you about that, but was appointed by President Obama to bring energy technology to the marketplace. Prior to joining the Department of Energy, he was also with UC Berkeley and with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where he was an associate laboratory director. And last but not least, of course, is Dr. Peter Fox-Penner. Peter's principal and chairman of the Brattle Group, and as some of you might have seen out in the foyer there, he's also the author of Smart Power, Climate Change, the Smart Grid, and the Future of Electric Utilities. So someone that can truly speak about an issue about the business models. So with that, before we start in with our discussion, as Jen mentioned, that we're going to start with a quick presentation, about 10 minutes from each of our authors and speakers, to talk a little bit about their topic. I want to mention that, as I did my introduction, I thought there was 4 drivers. And to me, the 4th driver is relationships. It's us. It's the people here, and it's all of us who are going to be working together. So hopefully we had a good opportunity for most of you to have the discussion in our pre-reception to talk and to build those relationships and share that information. Because I think working with leadership like these folks here and with the information hopefully we can share tonight, it's us who is going to be making this difference in the future. So welcome, and with that, I think we're going to be turning first to Mary.
Thank you. I'll come up and use the podium for this part, just so there's a little distinction between the formal presentation and then the conversation afterwards. Thank you for that kind introduction, Steve. Thanks for putting this program together. I was asked to give a broad overview of the policy landscape and where we hope to be headed over the next 40 years. That's easy for me to do since I expect to be here 40 years from now to check and make sure that everything has worked out exactly as I planned. We are, in fact, operating in California in an environment where we have a climate plan. And I do want to stop for just a second because I heard some chat about this earlier in the day to say how really pleased I am that we now have a federal plan announced by the president today. I was on the phone earlier. We had to set up a little phone conference for reporters who had questions, and every one of them kept asking me questions about the negatives and the downsides for California and what bad things were going to happen to us as a result of the president's announcement today. And I think they finally gave up after about 20 minutes because I just said over and over again, there is nothing wrong with this. This is good for California. We welcome welcome the support and the interest and the action on the part of our federal government, and the plan that the President has laid out is one that we want to be a part of. So I want to say that starting out and reflect what a change has happened in a very short period of time. But we here in California, of course, have struck out ahead of the federal government with AB 32. And I think you probably all know that our target is to reduce emissions to 1990 levels by 2020 for the 6 major greenhouse gases. And then we are also operating under an executive order that says that by 2050, we will have gone to an 80% reduction. But legally speaking, we're required to get to that 2020 goal, and we have to have a plan for how to do it. I am very pleased to say that we are on track to achieve those levels, and we're doing so at the same time that we are continuing as a state to reduce overall energy costs for consumers and make our businesses more competitive. We certainly acknowledge the fact that our energy efficiency standards that were adopted before AB 32 came along have saved Californians several billions of dollars a year, and that those savings swamp any minor cost increases associated with the transition that we're in the process of making to renewable energy. That's, of course, for the electricity sector, but the same thing holds true in the transportation sector as well, where we are expecting to be cutting about in half greenhouse gas emissions and fuel costs by 2025. And again, this is something that we did in partnership with the Obama administration, and it was a tremendous, tremendous experience. But even if we end up saying, okay, there are some small costs associated with our drive for cleaner fuels, and this is not a given at this point, but even if we did, the cost savings overall from the increases in fuel efficiency will significantly outstrip any costs associated with our low carbon fuels program. So we're working on both the demand side and the supply side, and we're reducing costs at the same time. It's also becoming clearer that reducing emissions is good for business. A recent report by the World Wildlife Fund and the Carbon Disclosure Project shows that for most businesses, investments in carbon reductions earn a higher rate of return than any other investments in their portfolio. And it shows that U.S. corporations can reduce emissions by 3% per year through 2020 while reaping a net savings of $190 billion. Underlying all of these nice numbers and statistics is energy efficiency. Over the last 30 years, California's energy efficiency programs have delivered $65 billion in net benefits to consumers. They've avoided the need for 30 new power plants and curbed emissions that were the equivalent of 5 million cars, contributed to a more efficient economy that produces more than twice as much GDP per kilowatt hour as the rest of the country, and supported a robust and growing energy efficiency industry. And this is why, in addition to the fact that we're the home of Hollywood and Google and many other fine things, everybody in the world wants to be like California. They want our life, and they want to copy our programs. So it's also a reason why my staff is increasingly trying to figure out how we can efficiently share information and spread what we're doing to states and countries around the world that want to know exactly what we did and how we did it. Obviously, it's not going to be the same for everybody, but we do think we have some things to share. At the same time, despite feeling incredibly proud of what's been accomplished here, we also know that we have a very lot more to do. We know that we're going to have to make an unprecedented commitment to our building and appliance energy efficiency standards and other ways of diffusing more efficient technologies if we're going to meet the ongoing climate targets. The plans that we have in place call for very large amounts of additional energy efficiency, and they also show that we're going to need to grow, particularly in our use of electricity. The fact is that we're going to need to electrify just about everything you can think of including most of our transportation sector, not just electric cars, but the entire goods movement system, which is at the core of our state's economy, if we're going to meet the longer-term goals, and we're going to have to do it with decarbonized electricity. We also need to look at annual efficiency improvements in buildings at about 1 or 2% per year. So efficiency is the key. We can't get there without it. Otherwise, the demand will swamp what we're trying to do, and it'll make our supply side challenge even harder than it is today. So we have a general policy vision for achieving these targets, but we also need a practical framework as well. And building practical frameworks for accomplishing goals is what my agency, the Air Resources Board, does, which is why we were given the task of doing the AB 32 scoping plan in the first place. We think that we have broad, good policies at every level in state government, either officially adopted or semi-officially adopted targets, and we're ambitious to get just about every imaginable kilowatt of energy efficiency possible, and some that people say are unimaginable at this point. We have targets adopted of reducing energy use in all existing buildings by 40 to 70%, making all new homes zero net energy by 2020, and all new commercial buildings zero net energy by 2030, and continuing to develop and push the most aggressive building and appliance efficiency standards in the world. Unfortunately, we don't always have the mechanisms to achieve that. There's a lot more that we need to do to develop effective mechanisms to deliver on this energy efficiency policy vision. We need to prioritize efforts to dramatically scale up efficiency and to develop the financing and institutional structures that will allow the private sector to take building retrofits and run with them. That's the only way we're going to get to our goals, and although many people have suggestions, and I'm sure we'll hear more about them tonight, we don't have these tools yet actually in the toolkit. We also, I think, can take a look at the example of our recent history with vehicle efficiency, where we have been able to achieve some pretty amazing results and are on track for more. Less than a decade ago, when the Air Resources Board was looking at setting greenhouse gas standards for vehicles, many experts thought that we would be wildly overambitious if we tried to achieve more than about a 1 or 2% improvement per year. After all, the federal government had not adopted new CAFE standards in over 20 years, and this was simply not going to be physically possible to do. Well, within a few years, as a result of political and market and technology conditions that changed, and with some effective policy push, thanks to Fran Pavley and others in the California legislature, we now expect to see 4 to 5% annual improvements in vehicle efficiency over the next 12 years, and there's more to come, and that's without factoring in our zero emission vehicle policies and incentives for the all battery or fuel cell vehicles. This is a phenomenal transformation, and after the president's announcement today, I think we could see similar results emerging in the heavy duty sector as well. So we know that things can change quickly when you've got the right set of assumptions and value proposition changes. We also know that we need to prepare the ground for that to happen. It doesn't happen just overnight without the groundwork having been laid. So we need to keep working through our partners in the energy agencies, as we call them, the Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, and with other stakeholders to more fully try to flesh out how we can create the value proposition for both building owners and utilities. Right now, my agency is just working on updating the scoping plan, and we're going to do that the way we always do our planning, which is through an incredibly open and collaborative process with what some people may think of as endless rounds of workshops and iterations of ideas. But in fact, we think we're going to get some very good recommendations out of that kind of a process, and that we'll be able to build on the first scoping plan, which was very measure-specific in order to take a deeper dive on some sector-specific proposals, including things like energy and water, and really try to take a much more holistic view of how we're going to, for the next 5 years, work on policies in those areas that build climate thinking into every aspect of what we're doing. So I just want to leave it at this point by saying that I think that the hallmark of California's success with AB 32 and before AB 32 in the areas of energy and pollution control has been that despite the fact that we have stakeholders that don't always agree about everything, and we battle things out in the regulatory process and in the courts, in fact, we have an extremely transparent and generally well-coordinated process to set goals and to get to them. We try to set performance standards and to work towards them and to do it in a way that allows everybody to see what the measures and the plans are that we're trying to use. And I think that's how we're going to continue on in the future. My fellow speakers are the ones who are going to add more about how the financial and technological solutions are going to emerge that are going to help us meet those targets. So I'll sit down and turn it over to them. Thank you.
So, Peter, you're up next for your introductory comments, which you may do from there, or the podium, or that seat, or wherever you'd like to be comfortable.
Well, when I went to see Coldplay, they did a song from the top of the balcony, but I won't try that, even with my wireless mic. Good evening, everybody. It is evening now, and it's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and my Brattle colleagues. And a real treat to share the podium with all of you. Of course, none of us had any idea that the day we would have this forum would be the day in the 5th year of his presidential term. The president issued his climate change policy, but it's a very karmic moment for me because we're here with 2 DOE leaders. One DOE leader and one EPA leader who have worked long and hard in this area. And I must reminisce a moment about my first day at the Department of Energy in energy efficiency. Some of you remember it, when President Clinton issued the 1993 Climate Change Action Plan. Mary was there. Arun was probably watching. As were many of you, it's almost 20 years to the day, and if you compare this to what the president issued today, I think you will see how far the issue has come. But with this being an energy efficiency crowd, I want to tell one story about it. There's quite a lot of energy efficiency programs in this. Some of you from LBIL, I see Chuck Goldman there, worked a lot on this. I had come in from doing a lot of DSM consulting, including with some of you, and I looked at some of these programs and I said, these are really basically like electric utility DSM programs. We need to write an implementation plan. And I was talking to somebody at the White House, and I'm not kidding, they said, what's a DSM program? It's certainly a sign of the times that the people in the White House now would be way ahead of us on this. And in general, I want to echo what Mary said about, in praise of the president's plan today. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to read the full PDF, which is much better than the fact sheet. And it has a lot of interesting things in it that go far beyond the press coverage on the emission standard for power plants, which, as important as it is nowhere near the entire plan. For you energy efficiency folks, there's quite a lot of talk about energy efficiency and performance contracting. There's talk about something many of you know more about than me, a standard and a federal performance contract, which seems to me you and I talked about 20 years ago. It's about time. But they talk about a $2 billion commitment to that, a $1 billion plan for renewable energy in Africa, which I think is extremely important. A big section on adaptation that Arun can probably speak to. That's, I think, very thoughtful. lots of interesting utility resilience programs in it. So there is, and I could go on, so there is a lot in it, in addition to the fact that the fact that the president has spoken on this and laid down such a clear marker will, I believe, change the dialogue in Washington for the better. So it's really great to be with you, and I brought all of you copies of this exciting plan to do the A-B comparison. Let's talk a little bit about business models and what it means for the energy efficiency industry. As you know, my book, Smart Power, is out for almost 3 years now. And 4 years ago when I wrote it, the thought that electric utilities would have very low sales growth and be entering an era of transformation was, mostly sort of considered to be kind of a kooky idea written by consultants in their spare time. Today, my favorite comment about electric utility business models was made by Greg Ander, who's here from the Energy Foundation and on the board of this great group. And he said, you can't swing a dead cat without bumping into a project on new electric utility business models. I think that's if he would do that. I think that's true, but more important than the fact that the projects have proliferated, there are real signs of change in the industry, in all segments of the industry, and it's turning out to be good and important for energy efficiency, which is really important, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But the drivers that I hoped would be there 4 years ago, as of today, continue to be there. Technological change has just been unstoppable, and as Mary said, more rapid than almost any of us forecast. That's not just the drop in the cost of solar energy, distributed PV, which is, as you all know, 75% in the last 6 years. But smart grid technologies have gotten cheaper, batteries are getting cheaper, all the technologies, electric vehicles are getting cheaper, and that's really having an impact. The climate imperative, in spite of the gridlock in Congress on this, I think continues to grow stronger. AB 32 was a gleam in our eye 4 years ago. Today, we've had three auctions now here with a very large trading system and lots of other things happening. And I believe that imperative will roll on. And finally, as I mentioned, and probably most impactful to the average electric utility executive who watches the metrics they watch, sales growth is down, and now that we have emerged somewhat from the recession and it has not bounced back, there is a feeling that there's a new normal, and the new normal is very, very low to zero sales growth in the industry. And that is, for anyone who grew up in this industry, revolutionary. When I started in the industry, one of the kind of teachable facts that my professors would use to illustrate the mathematics of exponential growth is that with a 7% growth rate, you double every 10 years. And electric power was growing in some parts of the country at 7% a year. Now it's 0.7% forecast, and I think that's high. There's a very good article on this done by my colleague Ahmed Farouqi, who's here, that's out on the table if you haven't seen it. So growth is down at, as Hamid says, the sub 1% level, and I think it's heading to zero and already negative in some places. So with those drivers, you have electric utilities from the executive level to the mid-level to the regulators now starting to say that the old business model that was built on sales growth and volumetric tariffs just won't work. And the search is on for not just new rate structures, as we know our big issue here in California, but really for new business models. We have to push far beyond the narrow question of whether we're going to tweak with the rate structure or even change it significantly to really get to the mission of utilities. And this is a time quite a historic time when we can re-mission our public utilities away from the mission that we gave them in the 1920s and 30s, which was basically to build out the grid, create universal service, and create as the most abundant supply side you can imagine, as cheap, harness economies of scale. That was the mission. They succeeded incredibly. This institution, PG&E, succeeded dramatically. And now it's time to give them a new mission. And they get that. And I think they're ready to do it as long as they don't go broke doing it. There are very significant, what I call pacing or gating factors that are affecting this transition. And they tend to be much less on the technological side, much more on institutional, political, and economic side. First of all, it's really hard to change public utility statutes. It's really hard to change the way Wall Street evaluates utilities. They've evaluated on their growth for almost a century now. And to move those, you need very intensive work in change management. Lots of visioning, lots of modeling, lots of discussion amongst the stakeholders. And that is really only at the earliest stages and is really subscale. We don't have enough resources to do that. The federal government has got its hands full with lots and lots of things, from Sandy restoration to electric vehicle CAFE standards and lots of other things. And it has big budget pressures. There's not a lot of other places that resources can come from. So literally kind of the mental and educational resources are really critically needed to be able to figure out what's really a kind of, it's easy to figure out the end point, but if you've ever tried to really work out how a utility can get from its current business model and its current finances and its current debt covenants and all of the things that make a utility provide universal service to get to a remissioned, revisioned utility of the future, and to do that in a way that keeps the lights on, keeps reliability, meets the environmental targets, which are costly, puts in a smart grid, and keeps electricity affordable to everybody, not just people who can put solar cells on their houses and get off the grid. That's a hard problem to solve. It needs lots of the kinds of resources I'm talking about on top of the new technologies that Arun's going to talk about. So maybe I should just leave it there and turn it over to Arun and look forward to some conversation and some questions with all of you.
Thank you. Arun, tell us.
The future.
Tell us all.
Well, first of all, thank you for putting this together. I think all of us said yes because it was you who asked, and it's delightful to be here. And thank you all for coming on a Tuesday evening. And I'm glad you're all well fed, because otherwise the questions could be tough at the end. But let me just say, yes, today is a historic moment that the President has come out with a climate plan. But since we're talking about the future, let me offer sort of a historical perspective. The reason we have a climate challenge is because of what we have done in the Industrial Revolution. So let's go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. At the moment this country was actually being formed, during the times of Washington and Jefferson, when the Constitution was being written, the way we used to travel is by horses. It was literally horsepower, whereas today we do horsepower. Okay, we go 100 horses taking us from our home to the grocery store, and 100,000 horses taking us across the continent in a few hours, which used to take months. And we used to use whale blubber for lighting, and now we use, hopefully, LEDs. So this last 250 years has been perhaps the most remarkable time in human history where our lives have been transformed completely, and there's no going back. The GDP has grown exponentially, and it was all about energy technologies, the whole last 250 years. But if you look ahead, of course we have a climate problem, but let me just give you some numbers. If you ask the question, in the last 250 years, how much of CO2 have we emitted? And the number is about 1 trillion tons of CO2. And the lifetime of CO2 molecules in the atmosphere is a few hundred years. So all the historical CO2 is almost there. It's a large capacitor. Okay? And so because of that, the temperature has gone up by about average of 0.8 degrees. But the average is just part of the story. No one has talked about the distribution. So we have now got data on the distribution of the temperatures. And we are reaching 4 to 5 times the sigma of this normal distribution that was unthinkable, at probabilities unthinkable in the past, which is what we're calling heat waves today. It was in the Midwest last year. It was in Moscow. It was in France and Europe in the past. And this hotspot is just moving around. And that's data. This is observation. So that's 1 trillion tons of CO2. You ask the question, based on today's known reserves of fossil fuel, how many more tons of CO2 can we emit if we burn all of it? And the number is about 3 trillion tons, 3 times more. And then you ask the question, if we are to go by today's economic growth and thereby today's use of fossil fuel, how long will it take to burn the 3 trillion tons of CO2? The first trillion took 250 years. The next 3 trillion, the number is about 75 to 100 years. So 3 times more CO2 in 1/3 the time. That's your 10x factor. And that's where we are headed right now. And so, so the question is, how do we address it? And often people make this argument that, oh, if you do the climate thing, it's going to be costly, so it's economic versus this. That's just a false choice. Because, there's a famous saying by the former oil minister of Saudi Arabia, the Stone Age did not come to an end because of lack of stones. Because we found better solutions. And the better solutions come from technology. And let me just be the first one to say, while technology is necessary, it's not sufficient. You need the policies to level the playing field, to create the demand. You need the financing, the access to long-term capital, also along with technology. So technology is important, but the other ones are also important, and it's the alignment of all that that is absolutely critical. So let's talk about technology very quickly. When you talk about technology, you have to realize that cost and scale is everything in energy. If a technology doesn't scale and come down in cost and scale up in volume, it doesn't matter. And so if you plot, I'm not putting a PowerPoint graph out there, but imagine if you put in a cost on one axis, the y-axis, and scale on the x-axis, you do more and more of something, the cost comes down. So you get what is called a learning curve. And today's learning curve, we have lithium-ion batteries, and we're going down the cost curve. Whether it is Moore's law for electronics, or lithium-ion batteries, or air conditioners, we're going down today's learning curve. And that is called incremental or evolutionary, extremely important to do that. But what we were asked to do in ARPA-E was not to go down today's learning curve, which is important. That's what the Applied Energy Offices, DOE, do. But for ARPA-E's job was to create entirely new learning curves, which will make it cheaper and better as they scale. And so that it is disruptive to today's learning curve in the best sense of the word. So our goal was to make today's lithium-ion batteries obsolete because they're better performance and cheaper. Or today's air conditioners obsolete because we could find better solutions. So you need, when you talk about technology innovation, you need both. You need today's learning curve, which is your insurance policy, and you need to take some risk to create a totally new learning curve. So what are those learning curves? Well, at one point, fracking and horizontal drilling and fracking was a totally wild idea, and that has now become the new learning curve, and natural gas is an entirely new story, and perhaps we can talk about that later on. But let's talk about solar. And let's ask the question, how much lower can it go? And so we created a program called Sunshot in the DOE, which was to reduce the cost of solar electricity, levelized cost, to about 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour within this decade. And that, in 2010, was a stretch goal. And believe it or not, it could be there. In fact, we are hearing stories that in terms of just the capital expenditure for the panel, at that time was $2 a watt. Today it's about 60 cents a watt. And the most of the cost is in the balance of system and not in the panel. Even if you gave the panel free today, you would not reach 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So what are the technological knobs to reduce the cost of solar and the levelized cost of electricity? And that has to do with efficiency and weight. And there's something called a Shockley-Quasar limit for efficiency. and that's about 30% or so, or 29% for most single-band solar cells. And if you look at solar today, the single crystal solar cell, the production level is about 24%. So there's a little bit of headroom, but not that much. If you look at cadmium telluride or polycrystalline, the production levels are at 15%, 16%. If they get to 20% or 21%, this will be a game changer. Because that will bring down the cost of solar because of higher efficiency down to the 7 cents a kilowatt hour. And if you do a little bit more, I think we can get to 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour within this decade, or maybe if not 2020, 2022 or so. And that's going to be a game changer because now you got distributed energy, and you have to now then look at the grid to see, because the grid was designed to be a one-way flow from centralized power station to zillions of loads, and that has to be rethought. There are things like, of course, wind electricity at various locations at already about 6 to 7 cents a kilowatt hour today. But where is the big problem in wind? The big problem is not in the wind turbine, but in the magnets. The magnets, we use rare earths from China to put in the permanent magnets. And China produces 95% of the rare earths. And there's a supply risk out there. So if someone can, and this is a program that we created, if someone could come up with permanent magnets which are better than what are called iron boride, dysprosium, neodymium-based magnets, then you could have a shot at a totally new way of making permanent magnets and affect the wind industry. Nuclear industry, small modular reactors, I won't go into that. Storage is, of course, a big deal. Today, the cost of storing electricity using pumped hydro is about $100 a kilowatt hour, which amounts to about levelized cost of 2 to 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour for storage, for electricity, additional cost. And if you look at the electrochemical ways of storage of compressed air, they were nowhere close to that. So we created a program on that, and we're seeing some evidence of pilot projects that are going on that are on the order of $200 a kilowatt hour, which is getting there. And I think we'll see new learning curves being formed in reducing the cost of solar. I talked a little bit about the grid, and I think this is a very fundamental infrastructure that we have. The architecture is still about 100 years old, not about, more than 100 years old, because the transmission system and the distribution network, that whole architecture comes from Tesla and Edison. And that was based on this paradigm of centralized generation with a transmission system and distribution network, branch network for the distribution network. And that has to, if you are to now introduce renewables in a distributed way, the idea of very tight tolerance on the frequency of 60 hertz, which makes integration of renewables very difficult, that whole paradigm has to be looked at, and hope to chat about that later on. In terms of buildings, I'm delighted to see the president talk about HFCs in the emissions, because the global warming potential of hydrofluorocarbons is about 2,000 to 3,000 times more than CO2. And there have been studies looking at the introduction of air conditioning and refrigeration in the developing economies, which is most of where the growth is going to be. And the global warming by the HFCs is going to be 25% that of the CO2 by 2050. So we have to look at it, and so if we created a program in ARPA-E to look at not only doing refrigeration at the same cost and performance using refrigerants which have a global warming potential less than 1, but also taking today's air conditioners and making them twice as more efficient than what is done today. You see, in air conditioners, the way it is done today, the humidity control and the temperature control are all coupled. And if you decouple them, you could reduce energy consumption by a factor of 2. And I can go on and on. Let me touch a little bit on transportation, because that's something that is, of course, a very important thing. And given that this is mostly on a stationary power, let me touch upon that. There's some few trends that are happening. The fuel efficiency standards has certainly driven the innovation in this area. In the long-haul trucking, I'm delighted to see a fuel efficiency standard for long-haul trucking or heavy-duty vehicles. There's a big transition going on in the long-haul trucking, and that is the transition towards use of liquefied natural gas. Because if you drive 100,000 miles a year, the price differential between diesel and natural gas makes it economical. The payback period is within 2 to 3 years for the truck, for retrofitting the truck. and also for putting up stations, LNG stations, every 200 miles along major trucking routes. So the business is essentially doing this, and which I think is an amazing infrastructure if we can reduce the leakage of methane, because methane global warming potential is on the order of 60 or so. It depends on the time, 60 or so than CO2. On the light-duty vehicle, use of natural gas is a huge problem in terms of cost, because the infrastructure for refueling for CNG is not quite there, and we have 160,000 gasoline stations. If you were to create that for natural gas, you have a real problem. It costs about $100 billion. So you got to have a different kind of refilling, and that's a storage problem, and we again focused on that. And the question is, can you fill it at home at very low cost, and thereby have a payback period about 5 years or so? And that is a materials challenge. Lightweighting, we really do not have major programs of high-strength steel or carbon fiber. Again, can you reduce the cost of these materials so that you can lightweight? And if you start lightweighting, you have to redesign the whole car. As Emery Lovins like to say, you have a chance to actually redesign the whole car. Why not start from scratch and do it? Biofuels as a whole, and let me just say something on batteries, because electrification is here. It's likely to happen, and it's all about the cost of the battery, cost and performance of the batteries. Today's lithium-ion batteries are about anywhere from $400 to $500 per kilowatt hour of usable kilowatt hours, because you don't want to go deep discharge. But there is technologies out there that can get us down to about $200 a kilowatt hour, and we are seeing learning curves, being early stages of the learning curves being formed. And of course, there's risk involved. Some of them will fail, some of them will succeed. But if we can get to $200 a kilowatt hour, this is going to be a big, because the cost of the vehicle plus the range will be comparable to IC engine and gasoline-based cars. And the tremendous amount of research going on, not just in lithium-ion, but beyond lithium-ion, lithium-sulfur batteries, et cetera. But let me just end by saying that these technologies, we are seeing a lot of new learning curves. One of the experiences I had was I was fascinated going from Berkeley and LBL. I thought I sort of knew what the technology innovations were going on. It was mind-blowing to see how much innovation is going on. So you just have to catalyze that and give targets and funding for the science and engineering infrastructure that we have in the United States, which is, I believe, the best in the world. If you give them the motivation and the target and the funding, they will innovate. But again, let me just reiterate that innovation and technology is necessary, but not sufficient. You really have to create the markets and the financing to really scale that. Let me stop out here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Arun. So with the context that we just had, a bit about policy, a bit about business models and markets, and a bit about technology, we're turning to the part of the program where we intend to have some discussion with the panelists up here, and then do that for a bit, and then turn to questions from the audience. Each of you should have a card. If you're interested in preparing a question, you can provide that, which I bet are being passed out right now, and then turn those question cards over to folks who will be collecting that. So with that, and thank you for your introductions and providing that context, it's an efficiency council crowd, or about a quarter of them or half of them. So why don't we start with an efficiency question? Each of you mentioned efficiency, sort of pandering to your audience here, I see. It's great. Everybody agrees it's great. Democrats like it. Republicans like it. It's first in loading order here in California. Our investor-owned utilities, their ratepayers pay about $1 billion a year to support those programs. But we're still having energy use go up. It's maybe going up less, but still going up. We have an 80% carbon reduction goal. We have big goals with efficiency. So what's the deal with efficiency? Can we get there with voluntary actions? Most of our work, that many of us do, say, through the PUC type programs, are voluntary actions. We do have a codes and standards program, but is it going to take more codes and standards? Is it ultimately going to take mandatory action to get to our efficiency goals, or can we get there with continuing with this combination? And maybe, Arun, you start with technology, maybe take it first. Take it down.
Well, I mean, first of all, let me just say that I want to acknowledge what I learned about efficiency from my colleagues and friends in EETD, in Lawrence Berkeley Labs, and Chuck Goldman is right here taught me a lot about this issue. So here, let me talk about building efficiency. I think perhaps the most successful, as you all know, in terms of efficiency is appliance standards. And one of the things that I find fascinating is that when appliance standard was introduced, obviously the idea was that because of more efficient appliances, the life cycle cost will go down. And what is also found, and there's data showing that, there's not only that the life cycle cost comes down, the purchase price comes down. And the question is, why does that happen? There are a lot of various economic theories about that. But basically, when you give a target, and if it's judiciously kept, then you have innovation. And the innovation basically drives competition. And thereby, the purchase price comes down. The question now we have to ask is, if you're looking at buildings, and you look at the buildings industry, the industry is very fragmented. The process for building construction and all is also fragmented. And there is no target. And we don't measure anything in the buildings. We have codes. We get a building designed on a computer. We get permits. We get codes, and we meet the codes, and we build it. And we don't have any requirement to check it. It's like building a 787 and without ever testing it. Now, 787 may not be the right example, but a 747, and without ever testing it. The industry will not allow that. And I really think, and I'm glad to see the President announce that efficiency standard based on measurements of how the federal buildings, and he's talking about the federal buildings, because people feel that once you introduce standards, the cost will go up. Well, let's take the federal buildings, put some standards based on measure values, because sometimes the measured values are not exactly how you design. In fact, a lot of times we don't even know where the inefficiencies are. But once you start measuring, you will then figure out where the inefficiencies are because it's not according to design. And that's when the process starts of making it more efficient. And I really think that if the President says that we're going to do federal building, I hope it is based on measurements and measured standards, because that's where the gaps will be found out.
Mary, it sounds like you've got some thoughts on that.
Well, I do. I don't know that I have a prescription. I totally agree that we need to measure better so that we actually can account for what we are accomplishing and see where we need to do more. I don't think we're delivering information to consumers in ways that they can use. I think we make an assumption, which maybe is right for economists or even regulators, but isn't in fact true. Speaking as a consumer, I don't think people actually do read their electricity bills. I don't think most people actually know what they're paying for electricity. Whatever it is, they think it's too much. But we have so many different ways of hiding what the cost actually is. And compared with other things we pay for, it's not something we can shop for. It's not something we feel we can do very much about. Even as a homeowner, if I buy a more efficient washing machine, I feel really virtuous about that. But my kids are doing more playing with video games. It may make no difference whatsoever in my actual bill. How do I know that I accomplished anything by buying this wonderful new appliance? So we got to find ways to make this all more transparent and usable to consumers. Maybe we need, for people who aren't, people who are purchasing homes or people who are looking at renting, either residential or commercial, better ways of actually rating the efficiency of the buildings that we're looking at and allowing customers to see the benefits of being in better, more efficient buildings. Maybe we need ways to directly put money in people's pockets if they are saving money, saving electricity, that is, because we want it. I mean, this is a slightly to the side example, but with AB 32 and the cap and trade program, we gave the allowances to the utilities for free, required them to be managed for the benefit of the customers. Public Utilities Commission is going to see to it that beginning next year, people get a dividend in their bill, which will actually be the climate action dividend. They're going to see that on their bill called out specifically as what's been accomplished as a result of reducing emissions. So, I mean, there are mechanisms that we can use, and we need a lot of smart people thinking about how to do that.
Two of the things that both of you mentioned was talking about information, and as part of the solution information, we benefit in California. Assemblymember Skinner passed a bill, AB 758, which the CEC makes responsible for information around existing buildings, and part of that's disclosure and labeling. They had their first workshop yesterday, actually, in working with information. I don't know, Peter, if you have comments on using information as a bridge in voluntary and mandatory action, or do you see roles and maybe the utility of the future as to what that role could be?
Well, of course, all of us who've been in this business knows that there is no silver bullet in efficiency, and that you need a very broad portfolio of programs and a broad portfolio of tools and resources. That includes some mandatory programs. Codes and standards have shown themselves to be unbelievably cost-effective, completely collapsing the information barriers down to specialists, and accomplishing important things. But also, and I think California's research shows this, they're certainly not the answer alone. So you have lots and lots of market-driven and policy-driven programs as well. I think we've all known for a long time, since the 70s, that energy efficiency being an all-capital resource, basically, you need information, lots and lots of it, much more than you need to flip a switch or even buy more power. The information you need to save more power is just an order of magnitude or two more than you need to just do the easy way out and buy it. So you need information, you need capital, you need financing, whether in the form of loans or adding it to your mortgage or simply reaching into your pocket or whatever it is. Energy efficiency is 100% capital. So it's all financed up front. That's coming from this economist, and it's unique in that way. So you need capital, and then you need lots of logistical support. Anybody who's ever tried to retrofit something in their house knows you need some good contractors and plain old logistical support, and then policy supports are also essential. So you need all of those things. And that's as true today as we sit here as it was when the first articles were written about this in the 1970s. What's different today, and what you can sense that in the vibrance in this organization, in this room, is that there's some new tools coming into the fray, and also some new business models to incentivize this. The new tools are obviously mostly information tools. It's unbelievable how much more information you can get about your home's energy use. It's infinitely cheaper. It was unthinkable that I could know as much about the energy use in my home sitting here in California when my home's in Falls Church, Virginia, as I can now get very cheaply on my phone, and I can control it. So the information you can get and harness is orders of magnitude larger than it was, and that helps attack that one dimension. And entrepreneurs are figuring out ways to help consumers use that information, whether it's Nest and My Thermostat or O-Power or any other folks. There's probably lots of you in this room. There's one company that came to me that's making like a Farmville-style game for how you save energy. Great idea. So the information part of this is expanding by orders of magnitude. It's getting cheaper by orders of magnitude. Unfortunately, capital is still scarce, and it's in fact more scarce after the Great Depression, when so many people lost trillions of dollars of wealth and their homes became underwater, and it's harder to get mortgage financing and so on. Fortunately, there's some new financial tools that are emerging, PACE financing and on-bill financing, I guess more generally, but capital is still expensive and it's still scarce, and that's something we got to work as hard as we can. And then, maybe I'll stop there, but the other resources are also important. And just to finish up on a note about utility business models, utilities have been sources of all of those resources, and it's one reason why they've made electric utility energy efficiency programs a success. They aren't by no means the only success in the energy efficiency space, but utilities, as I say in chapter 10 of my book that you should all buy, a little plug. improving my capital by that much. But electric utilities can uniquely contribute just about all of those resources and direct them all at once. They can provide information, capital, logistical support, and policy support all at once. That's made them very unique actors in the energy efficiency space. And in a new business model, they can continue and even expand that alongside lots of new deregulated private sector energy efficiency entities that are emerging.
Peter, I think you have to take it even farther than that, because why would I mean, I'm not an energy geek. I don't want to play around on my computer with a model that shows me where, what lights are on in my house when I'm at my office. You can't make me do it, and I'm not going to. So what do what's going to
Is Arun
solve
going to
that
provide
problem?
is the technology going to be there to make it
Technology
more?
can easily be there to do that. I think I agree with you that the question is,
That we keep ignoring somehow along the way.
that's right. And
But I completely agree with you. There's the front of mind, back of mind debate, if any of you remember that. The magic will be, Mary, when either policies or businesses, entrepreneurs, can harness that information without making the customer have to worry about it. That's what it's all about. That's what utilities did. I don't worry about turning on my light because utilities run around and they spend enormous amounts of time over the last 50 years thinking 100 years ahead so that the energy's there when I flip that light. And energy efficiency companies will do that same thing. They'll say, I've analyzed your house. Here's the way to save money. Sign here, right? And it's business and policy, and I think utilities have to substitute for us becoming energy experts and doing it ourselves. That's crazy.
So, Peter, on that, in some ways, we've kind of given the soft first question about energy efficiency. Let's maybe talk about another resource, natural gas. And maybe I'll turn to you first for this as well. Natural gas, bridge to the future, dead end. And as many folks have mentioned this evening, with the president announcing the intention of regulating not only new power plants, but existing power plants, what's going to happen to fossil fuels? I mean, how do we bridge that? Is natural gas that route? Or does it send it down a false path of investment?
First of all, I think the record's crystal clear on this, and the president has now spoken as well today. Natural gas is a bridge, and we're on it, folks, today. We're on it here, burning it here in California, and everywhere else pretty much in the world. So we're on it where natural gas today is what's complementing the renewables as they grow. It's what utilities are building in place of coal plants in this country and in Europe, thankfully. And by the way, I'm not being facetious. There's actual text in the president's climate plan, if you look, that says natural gas is a bridge fuel. So we're on it. This, however, is a richer question than I don't mean to be facetious or flippant about it. At Brattle, we're doing some very interesting work for the Mitchell Foundation, which was funded by the guy who invented fracking, about the relationship, the long-term relationship between natural gas and renewables. And that relationship is very dynamic, it's complex, and it depends on the time frame. Right now, natural gas and renewables, over the next 10 years, as storage comes up but isn't quite there, these sources are very complementary, and they're growing together, and they're going to need to grow together, and we're modeling that for them. When we get later in this century, we will have to cross the bridge of natural gas, get to the other side, and then take the bridge down, because we can't keep burning fossil fuels, the 3 trillion tons, did you say, of CO2 worth of fossil fuels in the ground, including natural gas. So it's a bridge, but it isn't the destination.
So from a policy or technology point of view, can we get on that bridge and back off that bridge?
Well, I don't think we should be thinking of it as something that we can fine-tune with quite such precision, and I'm very wary about any policy approach that privileges one fuel or bans one fuel. I think what we need are performance standards. I think that's what has saved us in the past from our own ignorance and allowed us to be more flexible when we needed to be, is that we looked at what we could tolerate from the point of view of the atmosphere. Certainly in the air quality program, that's how we did it. I am old enough to remember that when we first started regulating for ozone and particles, that people believed when the first Clean Air Act was passed back in the 70s that the internal combustion engine would have to be banned by about 1977. That was actually written into the law, that it would not be possible to continue with the internal combustion engine. And the engineers, right, have shown an amazing ability to make the internal combustion engine more and more and more efficient, to the point where we know that at least until the 2050 timeframe, that's about as far out as we can plan, there will be vehicles on the roads in California burning either gasoline or something that looks an awful lot like gasoline, whatever it's made from. Natural gas has definite advantages, particularly in power plants over coal, and also in heavy vehicles where it can reduce emissions. If we find that we need something like natural gas, we can make it out of garbage. I mean, waste material can easily be turned into a natural gas that then can be consumed in our vehicles. I think what all of that says to me is that life cycle analysis and understanding the full carbon and greenhouse gas picture of the fuels that we're looking at, and then allowing them to compete with each other, is going to have to be the way to go. So for me, I worry when anybody comes in wanting to sell me a bridge. But I think, as Peter says, we're using it anyway, and we see the advantages. There's other things we just plain don't know. We really don't know how much methane is escaping into the system because of our current drilling and transport of natural gas. And so I hesitate to say that we should push everybody onto the bridge.
That actually leads into one of the other questions that I wanted to follow up with Arun about, is the idea of government in policy establishing a performance base. When we have trade-offs in that, we've talked about we have in California all cost-effective energy efficiency. We have a 33% RPS. There's serious discussion of a 51% RPS. But in what way would technology or innovation respond, do you think, in terms of these policy options of specifying a technology or approach versus providing a performance? Do you have a sense on which is the best way to get the innovation?
I think so. I mean, just to make a quick point about the natural gas part, and it sort of connects with what you were asking. We spent a lot of time on natural gas in the DOE because it was sort of happening while we were there. And the two quick points is that when there's a lot of euphoria about natural gas, as it should be, but some words of caution. When you actually look at the production of natural gas from a well, it peaks and then it goes down. And no one knows where the tail goes. There's sufficient amount of uncertainty, and the error bar keeps on increasing as you go down the tail. So there's a lot of natural gas, but no one talks about the error bar and how much we actually have. And I think that's just one word of caution. The second word of caution is that we have a history that when we get one natural resource to be cheap, we forget about everything else. And that is worrisome to me. And I think this is a time that, yes, natural gas combined cycle gives you about 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. That's great. But that also gives you the breathing room for other renewable electricity generation to come down in cost to 5 to 6 cents a kilowatt hour so it can compete in the marketplace without subsidies. And that is where that's really the bridge, if you can give them breathing room. But to do that, it needs some scaling. It needs some demand. And that's where the policy really comes in, where it's a performance-based policy that creates the demand for other technologies to come in, or it's a carbon price. Now, carbon price right now in a legislative way, it's not going to happen in US Congress. But I think someone needs to start the dialogue for that. And I'm really delighted to see, you and Secretary Schultz, who's in stand with the Hoover, who is pushing for a carbon tax, a revenue-neutral carbon tax. And that is, revenue neutral is great because it sort of gives it back to the public as opposed to going in the treasury where people have concerns about. But that's the kind of thing that levels the playing field and creates the demand so things can scale. And that scaling part is absolutely important to bring the cost down and make it competitive in the future. And that's really what the bridge we're talking about, I think.
I think that's a good entree. I think a segue perhaps maybe to a last question for maybe a discussion, and then we can maybe have some questions from the audience if we have some cards, as to never say never. I think we've gone from there's absolutely no friggin' way that there will be a carbon tax in Congress to maybe just there's no way. So so there's hope. I think there's hopeful out there. I think
maybe not this year, maybe a few years from
maybe
now.
a few years. So let me ask you. I mentioned earlier when we got going about challenging us. We have folks from government here. We have a number of our representatives from our regulatory commissions. I'm very glad to see our colleagues here, as well as people from industry. For each of you, as we have the questions from the audience, what does industry need to do? What does government need to do? What would be the challenge, to these folks to go back to work tomorrow morning or tonight and take on the next challenge? Who wants to start, Peter? We'll go right to left, left to right, stage left.
First of all, I think keep doing what you're doing because all of you are in an industry that you've heard all of us say is very critical to moving us towards our climate goals and really energy security goals, economic development goals, job generation goals. We're still coming out of this recession. We've still got a long way to go, and we need lots and lots more jobs, and maybe the Fed's not going to help us as much as it has been. So, what you're doing, I can't think of a better thing to do than what you're doing in your industry. So do go back to work tonight and show up early tomorrow. But no, seriously, I think that's good. Other than that, I remember during I think it was the 2000 election cycle when I was at a rally, and we all knew that the vote in Florida was going to be very close. So he kind of looked down over his glasses and he said, this was in New York City, and he said, I want all of you to move to Florida tomorrow. All of you could move to Kansas and improve the energy efficiency policies there, but short of that, I think what you're doing is great and important.
So speaking, I guess, from my perspective, putting a price on carbon is where we have to go. I completely agree. We did it in California through a cap and trade program because there was no possible way we could have gotten a carbon tax at the time that we needed to adopt the scoping plan, so it wasn't even really under consideration. And I don't know when it will be, but it's at least now safe for people to talk about. However, legislators were talking about it this year, so I begin to think that maybe there's some possibility. The thing that worries me the most is the fear that government can't spend the money well if government takes in any of it, because we did do an auction, a state auction of a small amount of allowances from our program that we kept back in order to have some revenue to deal with issues that would come up or could come up, but also to have some money to invest in further reductions in accordance with the statute. And the amount of skepticism about whether that could be done well, whether we would actually be able to spend it in ways that we could account for, was really very high. There was fear on the part of liberal Democrats, who you would expect to be the ones to be the biggest spenders, that government couldn't spend money well. We're seeing now in the transportation sector, we're trying to reauthorize a bill called AB 118, which has provided significant amounts of funding over the last few years for investments in refueling infrastructure and in turning over the fleet to cleaner, zero emission or extremely low emission cars. I'm hoping that that's going to get reauthorized this year, but it's not a slam dunk because of this concern that the public doesn't really believe that these programs work and matter. We desperately need people who believe that we can bring new technologies on and that we need to jumpstart some of the infrastructure to be supporting those and to be spreading the word. So that's my major hope here.
Well, in terms of businesses and the government, I think what the government really needs to do for the businesses is to provide a long-term signal. The last thing the government should be doing is to do what we have seen in things like the production tax credits. It's on and off, on and off. And how can anyone devote capital to something when it's only going to last a year or a year and a half or so? And so that's the first thing the government needs to do. And the CAFE standard, for example, is a great example. By 2025, you've got to get to about 54.5 miles per gallon. That gives a signal. Now starts innovation. These things take time. And that's what the government really needs to do, and the carbon price, and hopefully not just a carbon price, a set price, hopefully a ramping up so they actually start taking action. On the business side, it's very hard for businesses, and I've been only in the corporate sector for 6 months, so that's my only experience in Google, which is kind of a unique situation. So one has to look at the long-term view. Energy issues are not short-term. So while we are looking at profit and loss and next quarter and this, that, which is important, there's nothing wrong with that. But someone has to take the long-term view to say that regardless of whether government comes along or not, there's a world reality that at some point we'll be living in a carbon-constrained world, whether it's going to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And given that reality, because otherwise we have other consequences that we can't even predict, and the insurance companies are trying to predict that, and they're pulling their hair out. And so given that carbon-constrained world, can the corporation take at least some part of their effort and money and look at the long term, not the whole, because the short term is important. And I think that's the challenge for the businesses, and whoever out here is in business, I will appeal to you to take the long-term view, at least some part of your effort to do that. Because at some point, the world will come to a reality that we are going to live in a carbon-constrained world, and you don't want to start at that point.
Thank you. So we have quite a few questions from the audience. I want to thank everybody for providing them. I've grouped them into two piles. There's the questions about the Kardashians. I think we're going to leave that for later, perhaps. They do seem to be the majority of the questions, but we're going to turn to a few others. I think one of them, though, I have a number of questions around on transportation. Not transportation, the Kardashians. So I have to remove some of those also. The question about, where does transportation, in terms of you had mentioned about electrification, or I suppose potentially natural gas vehicles, and the infrastructure for the utility business models, and innovation. So what do you see as the challenges and the opportunities associated with moving our transportation sector and other things outside of the vehicle itself in terms of land use planning? I don't know if you have some thoughts about, for each of your areas, the markets, the business model, policy, innovation for transportation.
Well, the government plays a very big role, of course, in planning for transportation, and the model that we built California on, which was major highways, ran out of steam quite a long time ago, and the railroads have not been building new facilities to the extent that they needed to, although we're beginning to see some investment in that area, both on the freight side and on the passenger side, which is very, very helpful. But to sort of look towards the future, I think it's going to be a pretty radically different transportation system. I think we're going to have rail moving people from city to city instead of airplanes. I think we're going to have a lot more things that happen without people driving at all. There are going to be different kinds of vehicles and different kinds of fuels, and we're trying to work on all of those at the same time. And we do have some better tools than we used to, particularly when it comes to the community planning side of things. Cities are more and more interested in finding ways to create what they consider to be sustainable, desirable cities, which includes not just transit, but places where people don't have to get onto any kind of a vehicle other than possibly a bicycle to do most of what they need to do. And I think we need to have a longer term vision of what that looks like and be preparing to help get there. But meantime, what we're doing is concentrating on the vehicles and the fuels primarily and trying to bring carbon out of both of them.
Is there a place in which there's an opportunity in terms of the regulatory model or the business model that particularly incorporates some of these ideas about transportation and/or ideas about what's going to support that transportation?
Let me take a slightly different shot at transportation. If you look at the stationary power sector, regardless of what we say, we have diversity. We have natural gas, we have nuclear, we've got solar, we've got coal, variety of different sources. In transportation, it's pretty monolithic. You got gasoline or diesel, and you got internal combustion engine. And in the long term, that provides vulnerability to our whole process, the whole system. And I think there's a need for diversification of both on the fuel side, just for our own national security, if not for anything else. In terms of the fuel side, whether it is gasoline or natural gas or for that matter electricity, on the way you convert that energy into motion, whether it is engines or motors and other things, or fuel cells for that matter. So I was involved, when I was there, I was involved in co-chaired a study for some time with the National Petroleum Council on the future of transportation. How do you reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in the transportation sector? And one of the things and this involved all the oil company, gas companies, some utilities and all that, and there were major powwows in that. But nevertheless, we came out with a study for what it's worth. And what it appeared is that, A, without policy, we're never going to get there. That's number one. Number two, we are likely to have, with the right policy, we likely to have a diversification of our fuel supply and the powertrain, and it could be actually cheaper than what we have today. So policy plays a key role. I'm not saying what policy it is, but policy plays a key role in reaching that milestone of 50%, but the diversity of sources and how we convert is also critical just for our own sort of security of the transportation sector.
We've reaching towards we've reached the time that we sort of set, but I'd like to take a few more minutes really for two more questions. A number of the questions here related around something I think maybe, Peter, you want to start with, and that's the price of energy. The price signal, some of the questions were about getting the price signal, but also I think the way one person wrote it was, are we just spinning our wheels when energy is essentially such a cheap resource? Is it the price? And what's the role in regulation, in policy, in our work and in driving innovation and moving towards a business model? Is price the key thing, or is it something else?
Well, price is a key thing, and it's where you always want to begin with that. I believe that even before I went to graduate school in economics, and remarkably, it's one of the few things they didn't disabuse me of. And most of the rest of it, I don't believe anymore. But price signals are absolutely essential, and that's true whether it's a public program or a private program. There's a myth that price signals only work if government's not involved, and they play no role if government involved, and that which they might have mentioned in my graduate school, is completely wrong. So price signals are essential no matter what the combination of public and private institutions are that's delivering the services, and it's always a blend of them. So that's number one. Number two, to respond to the questioner's question, yes, I think energy has been quite cheap in this country. It's cheap. It's the cheapest out of all the advanced countries in the world, and perhaps even almost all the world. I think there are a few places where it's a little cheaper, but it's been cheap, and as a result, we've used it quite wastefully, and we have it abundantly, and most of us pay no attention to it whatsoever, and leave lights on and all of that. But I think while that's true, it's getting more expensive here in California. The top tier is, 43 cents now, if I have it right? So there's places where its price is going up. One way or another, we are putting in too slowly and too gently price signals like the shadow prices that come from cap and trade or carbon taxes or whatever vehicle we're going to use. We certainly need that. So my second point is I don't view it now as so utterly cheap that it doesn't matter or it's not having an effect. One of the reasons I think we're seeing low rates of growth is that people have seen electricity prices and other energy prices rise in their era. I mean, gasoline is $4 and something a gallon. That's a lot by historic American standards, and it's having an effect. Gasoline use is going down in the United States and will go down for the rest of our lives. We're not spinning our wheels. Prices are not so cheap that they don't matter. And the third point is that I think through policies like AB 32 and hopefully at the federal level and even the global level, I think it's inevitable that prices or shadow prices on carbon will continue to increase the price of energy, and that will have a big impact.
I think the last audience question may be for the two of you, of two folks, one who've recently come from the Department of Energy and working in innovation, and for California regulatory. With the president's announcement today, which obviously all of us have not had a full chance to digest, but there's an overall message there. Is that going to affect California's regulatory stance on climate change mitigation? And will that message?
No, I mean, I think the president's, I have not studied every aspect of the plan yet either. I do have the PDF, but I also, have the highlights of it. And he was very, in his speech, several times mentioned building on what the states are doing, not just California, but many states have programs that are interesting and innovative to incentivize renewables, to promote efficiency. They want to attract new kinds of technology. Everybody wants to have EVs in their states and are looking at ways to attract them and get them there. So the federal plan is going to have to build on that. The specific part of it that's regulatory with EPA is looking at a part of the Clean Air Act, which very clearly calls out that EPA will set a standard that then states can either adopt or provide an alternative which achieves the same result. And I believe that when they start looking at how to get reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from existing power plants, there are many other states that are going to look at either cap and trade or other kinds of carbon pricing programs as an alternative to imposing a source-by-source limitation on their existing generating facilities. So that's already being thought about, I'm sure, and there's going to be a process over the next year or so by which EPA will be engaging with states and local governments in developing that regulation. And I would predict that it's something where California's approach, if not adopted in whole, at least is going to be something that is going to have a lot of influence as we have in the past.
So it's coming from 6 months from now from Washington, a senior member of the administration. Will this change the tenure in Washington, do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to see the president come out with this. At least some part of me says I wish it had happened in the first term, but that's okay. I mean, it has happened, and I think that's very important. Number one, I would say, is that the Senate needs to confirm Gina McCarthy to EPA, and that's very, very important. And I know there'll be pushback and all that. This is the time to fight. I mean, let me put it this way. This is the battle cry. There's a lot of fight ahead. Okay, this is just the start. Because what will happen now is, in accordance to what the president has said, the budget will reflect. And now the budget battles start. And there'll be policy battles. There'll be confirmation battles. So this is just the first battle cry. And I think the president and his team, the Secretary Moniz, hopefully Gina McCarthy soon, and everyone has to brace and create not the battle cry, I would say, but the partnership in the right way to actually get it done. When we talk about all of the above energy things that the president has talked about, what does that really mean? It means that you need to create the financial policies, the market policies, and the budget that reflects all that. And then that's the partnership that we need to create with the Congress to actually get it done. Because this is just the start right now. But I'm so glad this actually come out and said that.
Well, maybe as we end our evening here, maybe each of you, if you want to have your 30-second closing comment, you've demonstrated a sense of urgency that I think you've shared with us and information, but if you had maybe Arun, as you got to do the first.
First of all, thank you so much for staying so late. It's a working day, tomorrow is a working day, and I'm delighted to have you still be here. And thank you for arranging this, and thank you, Jen, for putting this together. This has been delightful. I don't know, I think I've said what I needed to say, but I'm just happy to be here. And I'm really, again, this is a historic day, and I hope that this really turns things around the speed is of essence out here. And we need to have this fierce sense of urgency and to actually turn this around, because this ship will take some time and effort to move it around.
Yeah, as I think I said at the beginning, this is not something that's going to be accomplished in the next few years. Dealing with climate change is going to be the work of generations, but we have the opportunity to begin to do it seriously. And I can't think of any better place to be doing it than in California. So I'm excited by the number of partners and the number of people who are interested in being part of it. So thank you.
Thank you. Peter is our visitor to California.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here, and I want to add my thanks to all of you for staying so late. I think in the spirit of sharing savings and efficiency, I will simply leave it there. Thank you all very much for listening, and say good night.
Well, for me too, I want to thank you all for being here this evening. I also, again, want to thank Opinion Dynamics, our Efficiency Council member, for organizing, and of course our utility partners in our speaker series, Edison, PG&E, and Sempra, as well as the Energy Foundation, who's a co-sponsor of the speaker series. So you all have a great evening. Go out forth and do good things. Thanks for being here tonight.